I am so delighted that Barbara was interested in inviting my good friend, Steve Beimel, to come and talk to us today. And you've all read his bio, so I won't get into all the details so we can get going. But I just wanted to tell you about how we met. It's now 18 years ago, and I know the number for a very specific reason, which I'll get into in a minute. But when Richard and I wanted to spend a month in Japan to celebrate my 55th birthday and his 70th birthday, yeah, 70th. Various people we spoke to, unrelated to each other, all said, if you're going to Japan, you got to meet this guy, Steve Beimel. And so we met this guy, Steve Beimel, and he helped us plan an amazing trip. And we hooked up with him for part of it. And Steve not only is extremely knowledgeable but about all things Japanese culture, but he brings a exuberant passion to it, a quiet, exuberant passion to his knowledge. And normally you travel with someone and they're your guide and then you go home and that's nice. But Steve and Richard and I became good friends because a couple of things happened. One is Steve and I are exactly the same age. And I figured out while we were there that the way you say 55 in Japanese is goju go. And that became our rallying cry through the whole trip. The other thing that happened was an exchange between Richard and Steve. We were in the town of Nagoya and Richard said, what do you call the people of Nagoya? And Steve, without missing a beat, said, Nagoyam. We had, in addition to a shared love of Japanese culture, we had a little of our own member of the tribe culture going on too. So Steve has much to share with us today. So without any further comments, I'm going to introduce my good friend, Steve Beimel.
Thank you, Betty. Go, you go. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just looking at, are we muting people or not muting people?
Why don't we all just do it? Yeah.
We will actually mute ourselves. Okay. We know how this game is played.
Seems like it seems like a good group to have comments from going through, but it can be a little distracting. So for everyone, so thank you. Yes, so I'm bringing today. It took me.
Share your screen, Steve.
No, I will, but I just want to give my introduction first. It took me, I guess, 50 years to put this together. So this is this slide presentation. You read my bio, so I don't have to go through that again. There's so much to cover with Japanese aesthetics. And, I'm not a scholar, I'm an enthusiast. This has been my life. I came here 50 years ago, exactly. And this has been my life for the last 50 years. So I'm sharing my life with you through Japanese aesthetics. And so I'm going to share my screen with you right now. There we go. Just do a little bit of housekeeping here. Zoom has so many things to click, and it covers my screen when I'm looking at it. So I just have to do a little housekeeping. Okay. So I've chosen 3 topics, 3 categories, if you will, around which to present the subject of Japanese aesthetics: wabi-sabi, miyabi, and datsuzoku. And I'm going to give you examples of all of these through architecture and gardens, ceramics, bamboo baskets, illustrative and decorative art. Then I'll show you a few unique forms of presentation that the Japanese use, which are common here, which guide our perception, and show you a few ways that the Japanese use color. Every one of the slides relates to one of these 5 points, the 3 aesthetics, concepts, and presentation in color. And I'll remind you about them as we go through. So So the term wabi-sabi is probably the most commonly heard description and maybe needs a little clarification. It's actually made up of two terms, wabi and sabi, which were combined sometime during history. Wabi would be transient and stark beauty, and sabi is a patina. It's a kind of weathering. It's sabi can also mean rust, so you get this the sense of something rusted and weathered and aged. And so these are all seen, wabi and sabi, through Zen philosophy. So these are the main concepts in Zen philosophy relating to wabi sabi of asymmetry, irregularity, simplicity, basic weathered, without pretense. And the last one, subtly profound, not obvious, ephemeral quality. That's yugen, but we won't go into the Japanese term today. We'll just use the English. So miyabi is a sense of courtliness. It's a refinement, decorum, the highest grace, and eliminating roughness and crudity. So if you have in a no play, for example, the actor will be portraying a beggar living on the street, but will be wearing the most impeccably beautiful costume. Datsuzoku is one of my favorites. You can see it here in this platter by Shoji Hamada, probably the greatest potter in the 20th century in the world. And you can see it so it's unbounded by convention, free and spontaneous. So the way he made this platter was he had something like 50 platters already and bisque fired. And he picked up a ladle and he just took one plate after another and he just splattered it. And one after another, and he built up this energy that comes out in the plate. And this is not a perfectly executed porcelain dish. This is stoneware with exuberance and datsuzoku. So again, through presentation, we look at transparency, layering, framing, transitions, and asymmetry, which we'll be looking at through some architectural photos. So Japanese aesthetics are based on ancient ideals, and nothing is more important in Japan than cleanliness, an essential element of wabi-sabi. The word for clean in Japanese, kirei, is also the word for beautiful. They have one word for beautiful and clean. And this would also include uncluttered and pure. The major focus in Shintoism is ensuring purity, largely by cleaning practices. One of the main functions of Shinto priests is to assist us in the purification process. So when we enter a shrine, before we enter the main torii gate, we wash our hands and we rinse our mouths. And this purifies us in a way to gain a greater access to, if you will, the divine space inside and the spiritual benefit that's present in the shrine. So you clean yourself and then you can access that grace, if you will. A Zen abbot once told me, I think he told Betty also, because she was with me a couple of times visiting this man. Zen abbot once told me that the way to read a person's character was observing the way they clean a house or garden. These are typical structures. They're replicas of buildings that you would have seen in southern or western Japan about 2,000 years ago. The building on the left here, you can see with my cursor, this is a dwelling, and the roof goes all the way to the ground, and the dwelling itself is subterranean. And in the center, this is a storehouse. This is a very important architectural form in Japan, and as I will show you. And you can see here, this is a storehouse for grain, and the legs of the storehouse and these pieces of wood here prevent rats from walking up into the granary. This is Ise Grand Shrine. It's probably the most, the holiest of all Shinto shrines And it was originally constructed about 600 years after the ancient storehouse we just saw. But it's the same architectural style. The unpainted building is made of solid cypress, and it's been rebuilt every 20 years for the past 1,300 years. They rebuild the entire thing every 20 years. And that's a whole ceremony in itself. Here's another view of it. Take a close look, because this building you'll never see this building if you go to see the shrine. You'll just see a tiny speck of it from above a fence. But the unpainted building, it's in the same way. It has clean lines, purity, simplicity, unpainted, that's just weathered over time, natural color of wood, profound grace of wabi-sabi. Going next door to China, till the 600s, Japan had no written language, and was greatly overshadowed by China, arguably at that time the world's most advanced civilization. Unlike Korea and Vietnam, Japan had the advantage of being completely independent from China. So Japan could pick what it wanted from China and adopt it and reject what it wasn't interested in. Most of the following were brought back from Japan during a 100-year period around the 600s. Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, a written language with, at that time, had 50,000, that's 50,000 characters, which could be written in 5 different calligraphic styles. Literature, poetry, papermaking, astrology, astronomy, organization of land and government, law, fine crafts, court music, theatrical forms, silk production and fine weaving, medicine, including acupuncture and herbalism, architecture, art, and garden design concepts. And Zen, actually, Buddhism, yes, but actually Zen was formed at that time, but came a little bit later. I'll get into that. And this, if you think about this, this is probably the largest voluntary adoption of one culture into another in the history of the world. Originally, when the Japanese brought architecture back, they also brought back with them the color vermilion. Though a few vermilion buildings continued to be built over the centuries, eventually the Japanese returned to their previous preference for unfinished wood in the majority of their pre-modern structures. So we have this simplicity, unpainted, thus weathered over time, natural color of wood, and profound grace. And this particular building is in Koyasan. It's a Buddhist town in the mountains, founded in the year 800. And there are something like over 100 temples in the town, and this is their main temple. This is a no theater stage in a Japanese ryokan inn south of Tokyo, and here it is in the winter. An important part of the Japanese construction style leads us to an example of presentation. So we see when we support the roof with posts and not walls, you can actually remove the walls. And so when you remove the walls themselves, which are the absence of walls, fully exposes the outdoors and allows the garden to be part of the building, the part of the interior living space. So if you can imagine this building with small traditional European style windows, this type of garden view reduces the need for decorating the interior. In Western architecture picked this up hundreds of years ago in the 20th century with floor to ceiling windows. And I saw beautiful examples of that on an architectural tour that Betty gave me of Chicago 20 years ago. This year, this year of 800, the year 800, which is about 100 years after the peak of Chinese influence, this brought the first golden age of Japanese arts and culture in what is called the Heian period. And by this time, the influence of China had already been transformed and Japanicized to their own native Japanese aesthetic liking. So this concept of miyabi is seen here in this later picture painting depicting a noblewoman. Traditional aristocratic ideal suggesting elegance, refinement, decorum, courtliness, and to eliminate all roughness and crudity and to achieve the highest grace. So you can see how Japanese art, line, color, asymmetry, and fashion had already come into its own. See how Japanese art, line, and color is seen in the elegance, refinement, and courtliness of miyabi in Shinto, which is frequently seen in Shinto. This is just happened to go to a shrine on a Sunday, and here was a wedding, and you see these weddings at shrines, larger shrines, just about every Sunday. You see these processions. We see miyabi in the decorum of a Zen meditation hall. We see it in the No Theater. In no place is courtliness more evident than in the court itself when the prime minister is being received by the emperor and empress. Zen influence from the early 1200s stressed stoicism and clean lines, purity, unclutteredness, and it further emphasized simplicity via minimal ornamentation, functionality, and honesty of materials, meaning that the facade of the building doesn't try and mask the construction materials, but it exposes them. So you don't have a brick building with a mortar facade or a mortar building with a brick facade. We see wabi-sabi naturalness, simplicity, unobtrusive beauty without pretense in the use of tatami mats. The formal tokonoma alcove became the central stage for presentation of art and flowers in a building. So this would be the extent of the ornamentation in a room, but you would change it every few days. Rather than having a lot of paintings on the wall all the time, you have one painting which you change every few days as the flowers are changed. And then you open up your floor to ceiling windows and you have your garden outside. Presentation via verandas can be used as corridors in the winter and balconies in the summer. They act as a visual, empty space connecting house and garden. It affects our perception. When looking at the house from the outside, the veranda looks like part of the house. From the inside, it looks like part of the garden. This is in the Shisendo. Shisendo. It's a garden and temple in the east part of Kyoto in the Eastern Hills. You can see that the posts and the eaves of this room form a kind of frame for viewing. And so the frame intensifies the image of the garden like the viewpoint of in a camera. But where this person is sitting and where the picture is being taken, we don't, from this viewpoint, we don't get the full sense of the framing. But if we sit back here, it's as if each of these frames becomes a painting in itself. And it really assists us in focusing in and getting the full intensity of the view. What Japanese did about 500 years ago was they standardized the size of doors, ceilings, tatami, windows. And it resulted in a really efficient and economical way of modularizing construction. So you could have a big room or you can have a small room. These lightweight Fusuma sliding doors offered a great versatility and flexibility. So you could have one big open pavilion, remove all the doors in the summer, or in the winter when it's cold, you could have one small room and you could conserve your heat fuel. Zen's influence on art was profound. One way was the presentation of paying attention to the space around and between images, and it's known as negative space, or ma in Japanese. The empty space around these characters is as important as the characters themselves. We see a strong influence of spectacular Chinese mountain scenery on the ink paintings in China in the 1200s. 100 years after the style waned in China, it resurfaced in 15th century Japan as Japanese ink paintings, using the same Chinese topography as an inspiration. Then by the end of that century, Japanese mountain ink paintings became the main inspiration for the dry gardens so frequently seen in Zen temples, a three-dimensional presentation of negative space. This is in the Daitokuji Monastery in Kyoto. It's where I study tea, right inside from this garden. The next biggest influence, speaking of tea, on Japanese aesthetics was that of the Way of Tea, the Way of Tea movement of the late 1500s. By understanding the aesthetics of the 30-year Momoyama period from about 1570, we can more easily relate to current Japanese aesthetics, including food presentation, architecture, and the arts. Grand Tea Master Sen no Rikyu was an aesthetic leader of the samurai elite during the late 1500s. The extent of Rikyu's legacy can be seen around the world today, and it cannot be overstated. Rikyu changed the course of aesthetic history by steering Japanese elite away from an ornate and ostentatious Chinese-style tea practice to one that was poetic, meditative, Zen-inspired, and natural, simplifying it down to its most essential elements. It was the aesthetic of refined rusticity of wabi tea. Rikyu was history's greatest proponent of wabi and sabi. So what Rikyu's teachings did was they greatly tempered Japanese preference for the perfect Chinese Ming Dynasty porcelain bowl and for the perfect Chinese Tenmoku oil spot bowl, to include the raku bowl, which he invented. Raku is lumpy, drippy, imperfect, asymmetrical. It's fragile earthenware, but it's much cooler than porcelain to the touch. And when you're drinking your tea, you can feel the marks left by the fingers of the potter. So unlike the static beauty of those spectacular Chinese bowls we just saw, our experience of the beauty of raku deepens with each use over time. Rikyu was also enamored by Korean folk rice bowls, and he took them for inspiration. So this is an example of a very inexpensive rice bowl sold in a market in Korea. And this so inspired Rikyu that it became the inspiration for the hagiware, which is one of Japan's most rarefied ceramic forms. So the rice bowl from Korea became elevated to the highest level of Japanese society at that time, which was the tea room. This is hakeme. You can see it's the potter. The original idea was that you have a piece of dark clay, and then you have some white clay, which is pretty rare. You make a slurry of the white clay, you dip a brush into it, and you just splash it onto this bowl. This in the folk tradition. So it was done very quickly, very rapidly. So you get a sense of the spontaneity of the craftsperson. And then the Japanese, as I said, fell in love with this and made them into tea bowls. This is a water jar, cold water jar for tea ceremony. So from the ancient kilns that produced this seed jar for farmers and which produced mortars for farm kitchens, Rikyu commissioned tea works of warm and robust beauty, and the style continues to evolve to this day. The cold water jar. In the years to follow, the concept of datsuzoku was seen in oribe ware. So please realize that this, what you're seeing here, is not the 20th century. It's the early 1600s, the late 1500s, early 1600s. Unbounded by convention, free and spontaneous, and alive with energy. Rikyu's influence resulted in a golden age of ceramics, where kilns throughout the country began to produce works for tea and for fine food presentation. Today, Japan is considered the international mecca of ceramics, leading the world in variety, technique, and skill level. This stunning karamono Chinese style bamboo basket, flower basket, or works similar to this were being imported from China during the time of Rikyu. These baskets were very formal and symmetrical. You see there's a fine rattan braided ornamentation. It's interesting because these were Chinese baskets that were imported into Japan, and they were so expensive that Japanese basket makers began to copy them, make fakes. And then it turned out that the fakes were actually better than the originals. So by that time, the artists started putting out their own names, signing their own baskets. Rikyu loved the wabi-sabi and the simplicity of natural design and materials as seen in a basket style that he designed, a basket vase. Moving forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, the Japanese became the true international masters of bamboo work. And so here we see datsuzoku, freedom from convention, irregularity, natural without pretension, in the wabi-sabi of an early 20th century work by legendary artist Izuka Kansai. So here's his work probably in the late 1920s. And then 10 years later, we see his work with its asymmetry. And about 1950, this is the kind of work he was doing with a mid-century sensibility. Finally, the contemporary work of Chiku Unsai IV. And this young man, he's as I said, fourth generation basket maker. He's currently expanding bamboo art methodology into architectural installations worldwide, which exemplifies many aspects of wabi-sabi and datsuzoku. When Rikyu designed his tea rooms, he rejected this kind of wall surface, this white showing style wall surface, in favor of the natural colored mud surface which lies beneath that plaster surface. Walls like this are still being made today. One of Rikyu's biggest contributions was in architecture when he designed and built several tea rooms, the epitome of wabi-sabi. So if you can see my cursor moving here, this is the door. It's about 2.5 feet tall. And we crawl, so presentation of the room is exposed to us as we crawl through this tiny door. We come into a a naturally lit room. It's somewhat a little bit dim. And we look up at the ceiling. You know, it's a tiny room. It's this 1, 2, and 3/4 tatami mats in size. It's a tiny room, and there'll be 5 people who come in to have tea in this room, plus the host. And so there's Rikyū moved us beyond claustrophobia by presenting 3 ceilings, 3 ceiling styles, 3 different kinds of material makeup at 3 different angles. What this does is when you come in and you look up, the room feels really large. It's really amazing. So we have these mud walls, and you see this one natural limb of a tree. All this speaks of a refined mountain hut. The presentation via sensory deprivation heightens our appreciation for the exquisite ceramics and lacquer implements we hold in our hands during tea. So you walk into this room, there's nothing there, and then slowly one exquisite piece of ceramic or lacquerware is brought into the room, which we get to touch and hold on our hands, and then it's all taken out again. It's all removed. So it's a heightened experience. And then we have a tiny bit of precious sandalwood is placed somewhere in those burning coals and incense, and spontaneously releases 20 seconds of rarefied fragrance at an unexpected time during the event. So Rikyū's impeccably planned wabi-sabi tea rooms of the late 1500s inspired residential and public architecture for the next 400 years. So here we see a much later room, a building many years later with all the same elements as that little tea room. This is a villa where the gate to the villa, it has a roof which mimics a farmhouse. This is a very, very refined villa, but the roof of the gate is a farmhouse, just giving us a sense, a taste of rusticity. Katsura Rikyū Villa was built in the early 1600s and was the first residential site built primarily on the aesthetics of Rikyū's tea rooms. So you can see these white paper doors here are removed for presentation of the world via floor-to-ceiling windows. The house cantilevers over a raised foundation, and this building could easily have been built in the 20th century, not the early 1600s. Here's a Rikyū-inspired tea garden, providing a quiet, intimate, subdued, green and mossy space, moist with dew, wabi-sabi's natural, profound grace, simplicity without pretense. And the essence of Rikyū's Sukiya style architecture has seen a stunning reinvention in the last 20 years. Rikyū's style of architecture, Sukiya style architecture, stresses natural textures. From the art of Ikebana, Rikyū created chabana, or flowers for tea, by reducing presentation down to its basic minimum. He introduced multi-course kaiseki cuisine with its focus on presentation. Most recently, this kaiseki has spread around the world, inspiring cuisines really everywhere. Other aspects of Japanese presentation include transparency and layering, which create the illusion of greatly expanding space. So transparency is seen when looking from outside of this building, through the building out to the other side and beyond, and layering of elements to create greater depth of field. From our vantage point when looking at this garden, the pond immediately in front of us provides a foreground of negative space. There are a number of waterfalls in this picture. There are 4 layers of waterfalls. There's one here, one here, one here, and one there. And so these layers creates, again, a sense of expanded space. Another way of making this waterfall seem the big one at the end, seem much farther away than it really is by zigzagging the stream, undulating the shorelines of the stream, having wide and narrow spaces in the stream, and then placing these 3 stones of similar texture and color in such a way that we assume that these 3 stones are the same size, and that this one appears farther away because there's a great distance between them, but actually this is a much smaller stone placed here, which forces that sense of distance. Of course, we don't analyze this consciously when we're looking at the scene. We just assume. And so this waterfall in the distance is really not that far away, but it really seems far away. Presentation being layering with bridges and creation of depth of field is seen here in this Chinese garden. And then this is the way it would be interpreted in Japan. The placement of the 2 bridges not only greatly expands our sense of distance, but it adds an element of mystery about what's beyond there. So actually there could be a fence or a wall be right there, but it's camouflaged. But all we see is this scene in the distance, and we think it goes on and on forever. Chinese are masters of presentation through framing, and usually placed a filigree around the frame as a kind of filter through which to look. The Japanese may have learned framing from the Chinese 1400 years ago, but their interpretation is again different. Transition is a highly developed form of presentation. In a given site, it allows an orchestrated hide and revealed approach to enjoying beauty as it unfolds to us. So we see something and then it's hidden, and then we see something else and then that's hidden. So we start here in a formal area with little detail. This is just outside of the Koto-in subtemple, Daitokuji in Kyoto. And this subtemple has devoted 25% of its total space just for its semi-formal entry area. The human mind subconsciously records physical events as reference points for experiencing time and space as we pass through. The more events we record, the longer we experience time and the farther we feel we have walked. So an example of an event may be from going from a wide area to a narrow area, etc. So I'm going to take you through this rather than explaining it to you. I'm just going to take you through it. So each time I mention something, it will be an event that your subconscious would be recording. Oops. So we turn into the first part of the entryway. We see a wall ahead of us. And then we turn. We see a gate, and then we go up a step. We go from a light area to a darker area. We go from a light area, a wide area to a narrow area. We step through. We see something in the distance. We turn and we see something else. There's a long corridor which we walk down, and it's relatively undetailed, so we get a sense of kind of a minor sense of monotony. making it feel like we're walking a bit longer than we are. We see another view, we turn and we see another view. We walk through again, wide to narrow, light to dark, up a step, turn again, we see another view, and here we are at the entrance. And this is our destination, the garden within. The Japanese are masters at creating balance with asymmetry. Anything from ikebana to gardens to the roof lines in a complex of buildings. The Momoyama period in the late 1500s, when tea became very popular, is simultaneously known for two distinctly different aesthetics. This first one is a subdued aesthetic embraced by members of the tea world, as seen in the work of Kano Eitoku, and the sumptuous use of gold leaf in a work by the same artist. The kimono is a form of presentation and use of color. It's arguably the world's longest running, broadest variety of high couture wearable art. Starting about 1,000 years ago, it was mainly worn by samurai elite and aristocracy until about the 1500s, when it became available to all people. The total number of designs that have been offered through the years is almost endless. Produce so few of each design, making it practically impossible to see yourself see yourself in somebody else wearing the same thing at a party. You just and this allows everyone to be totally original, one of a kind in what they wear. Silk is a prism which absorbs light and creates warmth and dazzling brilliance unseen in any other fiber. Japanese weaving is one of the world's most complex, allowing for three-dimensionality in weave, hand dyeing techniques with tiny brushes, shibori tie-dye, stencil dyeing, and embroidery. Traditionally, designers of kimono, decorative ceramics, and artists would inspire each other. Japanese are well known for combining the cummerbund, the sash, and the kimono in colors that are often considered out of the box for Westerners. Many of you are aware of the Pantone color books made in the West. You may not be aware of the Japanese palette as seen in Toyo color books, a parallel world of color. And I've taken a number of examples. So if you, from just personal observation, I noticed that in the West, when going to buy a sweater, there are more primary colors than these modulated colors. And in Japan, they offer less primary colors and more of these in-between modulated colors. 17th century saw the growth of the Rinpa school, a truly Japanese form of refined decorative art. This is a work by Tawaraya Sotatsu, Ogata Korin, and Suzuki Kitsu. 200 years later, as Japanese art was introduced to the West for the first time, the Art Nouveau movement was considerably influenced by Rinpa's style of presentation. Woodblock prints were a significant art form for the common people of the 16th, 17th, 1800s. When they reached Europe in the 1800s, they were a major influence on the Impressionist movement, with their greater focus on the presentation of the subject and elimination of excessive details from paintings. It also inspired a flat presentation in artwork, as we see in this work by Lautrec. Pre-modern times, we see in Japan's the world's most extensive presentation of illustration in books. So the Japanese public was predisposed to the advent of manga, which then inspired anime. I recently went to an exhibition of Japanese paintings, both oil and nihonga. Nihonga is a genre of art. This is oil that you're seeing here. Nihonga is a genre of art which uses traditional mineral-based pigment colors mixed with water-based binders, painted on washi paper or silk, depicting contemporary themes. So though beautiful, the color of the Western style oil paintings in the exhibition had a much stronger and harder feel, and I needed to walk back about 10 feet from the paintings to be able to really read them. However, the Nihonga paintings were so soft and so available, I could step right up to them just a few inches away and be able to absorb the color. Very accessible. And these, of course, are using that other palette of color. In the words of Junichiro Tanizaki in his book, In Praise of Shadows, I would have the eaves deep and the walls dark. I would push back into the shadows the things that come forward too easily, too clearly. I would strip away the useless decoration. I do not ask that this be done everywhere, but perhaps we may be allowed at least one place where we could turn off the electric lights and see what it is like without them. The Japanese aesthetics are very clearly seen in the craft world, in the Japanese crafts. The Japanese crafts have been honed and refined, the rarefied expressions of the human spirit that have been with us for hundreds and hundreds of years. I recently started an organization called Japan Craft 21. I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. This rarefied craft of Japan, some of the world's most outstanding, may be in large part disappearing within the next 5 to 10 years. In recent years, sales and production in the craft world of Japan has been declining at an alarming rate. You can see here in 1979, there were 300,000 fully functioning master craftspeople in Japan. And by 2015, that dropped to 100,000, and it's probably about 80,000 today. As an example, lacquerware, Japanese lacquerware from the Toyama area dropped 75% in sales in a 20-year period. Hand-dyed, stencil-dyed kimono in Kyoto dropped in a 10-year period, 72%. And Yuzen hand-dyed kimono dropped by 50%. So very low-priced kimono made by minimally trained workers offshore are flooding in as local weavers, dyers, and embroiderers who create true masterworks are struggling to compete. These are people with up to 10 years of apprenticeship are competing with, works made by inkjets in Vietnam. Few young people are capable of replacing the now retiring, internationally renowned Japanese bamboo basket artists. Wood joinery is generally no longer taught to young carpenters, and very few young plasterers can construct a bamboo mud wall. The list goes on and on. Though tens of thousands of master craftspeople still function, too many are at or past retirement age, and too often young people are not taking over. Also disappearing are craft support specialists such as unique tool makers, die blenders, brush makers, stencil cutters, and raw material suppliers who form a highly interdependent network in the craft community. Part of this is marketing. A brilliant marketer probably recognized our desire to wear something wild and crazy and fun like this. There are probably 500 million people in the world who have purchased something like this for up to $200. Couldn't we find spunky and feisty people to buy just a few more kimono? If just 0.1% more of the population would buy domestically made kimono, that industry would be well on its way to recovery. So the amount of marketing dollars going into this is a gazillion times more than what's going to this, which has created a market for something we never thought we would ever wear. If millions of people eat lunch from a plastic box, can we find a few thousand in the whole world who would rather eat from a cedar box? This might create a couple of jobs, help rescue part of an abandoned cedar forest. It really doesn't take much. Lovers of Japanese crafts worldwide are at a historic crossroads. We can revitalize Japanese crafts, or we could just passively watch as many disappear entirely. So 3 years ago, I gathered together a group of craft lovers who were saddened by the decline and, like me, just couldn't sit by and watch. Each of us had been touched by Japan and wanted to give something back in effective ways. Each one of us wanted to see direct results, and each one of us wanted to be an active part of a Japanese craft community. So we invited ourselves to create Japan Craft 21. Our mission is to identify vulnerable but viable traditional Japanese crafts and assist in their revitalization through clear strategy and effective action. We soon found a craft that fit our mission: high-level wood joinery. 80 years ago, there were 100,000 exquisite wooden machiya townhouses in Kyoto. Today, only 40,000 remain, with more disappearing every year. Then we met this man, Tomohiro Naito-san, a fifth-generation Kyoto carpenter who shared our vision of Kyoto rising once again as a beautiful wooden city. His problem was finding young carpenters capable of joining him in building his vision. He had a vulnerable but viable craft, but needed a strategy and action. So our group, Japan Craft 21, helped him establish a small weekend school and fully funded it with scholarships for young working carpenters in Kyoto, giving them a pathway to true mastership. This is our first graduating class of 6, seen here with their master teachers. These are the first young people who have collectively been trained to do this work in a long, long time. We've reached our first big milestone as graduates begin helping Naito-san construct the first authentic wooden machiya in Kyoto in 85 years, built with joinery and no nails. The already sold house will feature improved fire and earthquake resistance, as well as high energy efficiency. A traditional structure which speaks timeless Kyoto on the outside will be designed for modern life on the inside, such as a cypress bath with a jacuzzi, and with the same beautiful, timeless joinery. A masterfully crafted modern interior. The owner can choose whatever interior they please. So this spring, we're going to enroll 10 new young working carpenters in a weekend wood joinery course. And we've also started a bamboo mud wall construction course. We have 5 people for that. This is beginning next week. So in the coming year, we plan to add these other other building trades, gardening, shoji making, wall surfacing, to upgrade the skills of young tradesmen. Having achieved success through our first project, we've taken a bold step by creating the Japan Traditional Craft Revitalization Contest in order to maximize our resources to really make a difference. Each contest is designed to revive a traditional Japanese craft to flourish in the 21st century. We're thrilled that the Asia Society from New York, in their Japan Center branch, has joined us as co-sponsors of the contest. Our first contest began 2 months ago, so we're in the middle of it right now. The winner will be an exceptional individual with an outstanding idea, talent, track record, and passion to manifest their craft revitalization idea. We'll provide the winner with $50,000 in funding capital for their project and a mentor group of experts in a number of fields such as business, IT, marketing, etc. The winner we hope to choose will someday succeed like the following 3 people. Like Nakagawa Shuji-san, a 3rd generation cedar bucket maker who now produces champagne buckets for French wineries. Or the 5 young Tokyo Art University graduates who went to rural Shikoku Island, learned natural indigo dyeing from seed to sales, learned how the whole process, and now their Buaiso brand is seen around the world. Or of like Horiki Eriko-san, whose huge original washi paper creations are now seen as architectural installations around the world. So that's our project. That's the aesthetics of Japan in a nutshell. And any questions? Any comments?
Oh, that was so soul satisfying.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for
Sorry, unmute.
with us.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. The aesthetics of Japan. You know, I'm sorry, Sherry, I bumped it.
Oh, that's okay.
I put it in front of you. The one, you know, Michael and I collect Japanese ceramics, both modern and older, plus Chinese ceramics. The one area, you know, all of this cultural borrowing from China, I always thought an area where the stark difference in the aesthetic, wabi-sabi, for example, you don't see that in Chinese ceramics. In fact, they would consider it barbaric, but the divergence of those two incredible cultural, you know, legacies in both cultures is stark. And actually, I hate to say it, our collecting in Chinese pottery is pre-porcelain, because we actually don't. I mean, I appreciate it, but I don't like it as much as Japanese ceramics, and that's where our collecting has been because of that. But it is just the other area that I thought was really divergent is lacquerware. I mean, Chinese lacquer, which again is the originated the art, is so different, and so the divergence is really incredible. On the other hand, there are other areas like painting, although you mentioned rimba. Well, that of course is essentially, I mean, echt Japanese,
Yeah.
but you do see the continuation in Nanga school paintings of the aesthetic of Chinese landscapes. And that's actually the area that Michael and I have collected in when it comes to Japanese paintings, rather than something. And of course, an expert in painting would immediately understand the difference. I mean, they'll look at the painting and say that's not Chinese, but to us at a lower level of aesthetic, there is a resemblance there. So anyway, we really enjoy the Japanese aesthetic very much. We've been to Japan a few times. We've been to China more, but we hope to come back when this scourge is lifted and we all can travel. But anyway, thank you so much. That was a wonderful sort of survey, of the various schools and differences.
Thank you.
Someone
Shari?
wants to say hi to you, Steve.
That's nice.
There's Richard.
Oh, Richard.
Hi,
Yes,
Steve.
ma'am.
I only came in for the very last, just 5 minutes, but what I
Seen
heard,
it 74 times though already, so it's okay. You're going to give the next presentation.
thank you so much.
Interesting. I can see where Frank Lloyd Wright got his inspiration with both his prairie style and also the hidden entrances, where he duplicates that all over the place, or he did.
Right. Well, he worked here for many years.
Yes, and did the hotel.
The hotel. Yeah, well, Katsura was that villa that I showed with the cantilevered, with the raised foundation, the floor to ceiling windows. That was a mecca for Bauhaus people in the early
Sure.
30s here. They're just, I think that was when they discovered it. For the
Oh, the
first
floor to
time.
ceiling windows, of course.
What I also found interesting is the color palette, which I loved. Armani took that color palette in, what was it, 80s, 90s, and it was so subtle and the lines were so specific, but it had to have come from the Japanese palette. It was not a Western palette.
You see that also in the French painters. Someone like Vuillard moved away from that primary palette and has a very muted sensibility that is much more subtle in terms of color.
When I gave this presentation, and I gave a different presentation that Betty got to see. Well, you got to see it was a very the technical part didn't work out so well with the Asia Society's cameras, but I spoke about this period when in the 1870s when Japanism just took Europe by storm, and a way of looking at things and a level of craftsmanship that people just couldn't comprehend. Of course, European craftsmanship is legendary, and I'm not saying that Japanese was better, but it was just a whole area of work that they had never seen in the kind of lacquerware and the kind of textiles in the ceramics and the baskets. It just took them totally by storm. And of course, the paintings, it's the Impressionist movement was so influenced. But it's interesting that by the time, the woodblock prints, I'm sure Jack could speak about this. Woodblock prints was really, it was just this very popular form. They were like souvenirs that were given in hot springs. People would buy them like we buy postcards. We used to buy postcards, or they were theater advertisements. It wasn't a high form of art by any means. Beautiful, of course, but anyway.
Yeah, and actually, Frank Lloyd Wright was a major dealer here in Japanese print, and some of the major local collections were curated by him. Although,
Janice Cass has got it.
yeah, so it's and the Art Institute actually has one of the better collections, not the best, but one of the better collections in the United States. So, and that a lot of that had to do with early collectors in Chicago who were influenced by Wright.
But the fact that it was a popular art really endears it in a way. It's the simplicity, the availability, just just an exquisite form of art, making it available to a huge
Mhm.
population. Whereas
Yeah.
the art that we were speaking of a few minutes ago was only available to very, very few people.
And of course, now it's gotten, I mean, Hokusai's work has gotten incredibly expensive. You know, his Mount Fuji and all that are millions of dollars for great copies of it at auction these days.
I was,
Steve,
Joseph,
that's okay. Yeah, Steve, I just wanted to say, I think you know some good friends of mine. Heidi Durning was my dance partner for a long time. She has a lot of nice things to say about you and your wife.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, she lives, I think, a little village over from you, I think,
Yeah,
over
we're
in Iwakura.
one village away from us, 10 minutes by bicycle.
Yeah, and do you know the potter Steve Tomaszewski?
Oh, sure.
Okay, I'm just sitting here at my desk. This is Steve's pottery. This was actually the view from my apartment in Kyoto. I lived on Yoshida Yama for 7 years.
Oh, really?
And he would come and do designs for my place. And now he still uses this. I think he's selling more funeral urns than anything else, I think, with this design. But this is another of his that was very much like a lot of the things you were talking about today. And I thanked him for it one time. I've kept it for more than 30 years. I've kept this. And he said, I just brought some salad over to your house for dinner. I wasn't giving you the bowl. I just never took it back. And I said, well,
Is the bottom glazed? Joseph, is the bottom glazed as well?
yes, except for the very middle part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, but except that small place in the center that was showing his clay. It's Shigaraki clay.
Yep, it's very much his. I love washing it because you can feel his hands on the bowl. But it's if I probably only kept one thing, it'd probably be this.
You know,
It's
add insult to injury, you ought to say to him, well, you know what? I really love this bowl, but I want you to send me a box.
You
in the
should
same
have
color.
a box.
Well,
But there's a number of foreigners, yourself, Steve, Heidi, Quentin. There's a number of, I've lived in Kyoto for 7 years, and the expat community is so lovely. It's the most lovely people. And now you're in that very elite group of people who've lived there decades and decades. But man, you're blessed to have some really lovely colleagues and friends up there in the foothills. I'm green with envy. It was such a beautiful talk.
do you know Richard Milgram?
Oh, sure, of course.
Yeah, we had a lovely 2 days with him in Kyoto and had dinner with him and his wife. And
Richard and Yellen.
and unfortunately, we had to buy some of his ceramics. No, I'm only,
I have, Jack, I have one of his tea bowls that I bought from Doug Dawson.
yeah.
I
Extraordinary.
met him when he was here.
person. I love his
Wonderful
work.
guy.
I love his work.
Yeah.
He brings just this softness to
I'm gonna go
ceramics.
get it and show it to you.
And
Oh,
by the
look at
way,
our feet,
and
look
by
at
the
our
way,
feet.
his wife makes terrific banana bread.
Go, yes. Go get the best banana bread. Go get our piece.
Oh, stop. This
It's
isn't a show and tell here.
come on. No, it's got to be with arm's length. You either use it or you don't. Okay. I learned in Kyoto you're supposed to use it, and I use it.
Well, you know something. I just had this extraordinary experience. I was asked to write an article to interview that's that yellowish color. I
my
love
Richard
that
Milgram.
That's
color.
one of the reasons
And
why.
that really subtle yellow glaze.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
his,
nice.
that's his signature.
That is my of all his works. I love that the most.
And this is, you know what, Betty, we've got to combine ours because this is the cold water jar and you've got the tea bowl.
Okay. We need someone to come and do a ceremony for us.
That's what we need.
Tea for us. I love this little wonderful place for your lip. It's just
It's
beautiful.
beautiful.
Just a nice little touch. It's a great
Beautiful.
bowl.
So I just interviewed
Anyway,
last 5 days ago a Shino artist Shino ceramic
Oh, I
art.
love Chino Blade.
And it was just there's I painted a kind of a bleak picture. There's still extraordinary people working here. Ceramics is still is a pretty strong suit here. It's I'm not that worried about ceramics, but
I agree with you because there's a huge international, not only Japanese market, but there's a huge international market for modern ceramics. And the modern ceramicists are terrific. I mean,
True.
one beautiful thing, coming out, and they've got dealers that do promote their work in the United States. And we
Yeah.
also, Robert Yellen, I'm sure, and of course he's got a big international presence. And we were
Roberts I think he spoke to a group
He
that
spoke to our group.
Betty attended on the tour she with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
I was lucky enough maybe 30 years ago
Putting this
to
back.
go in to see the Asia Society no theater kimonos. And I mean, you just stood in front of them in awe. I mean, I'd never seen anything like that. And each week they rotated because it was textile. So I only got one of the 3 weeks, but oh my heavens.
When we were at Robert Yellen's, there was a young man, American, who came into the gallery with an American couple. And while they were looking at pieces, I talked to he was a designer, I think, interior designer or something with designer architecture. And I thought it was really, when you talked about expats in Kyoto, it reminded me of him. He had transferred his interest in restoration to the Japanese culture and was actually one of the beginners, or at least my impression was, he was one of the founders of this movement to restore Meiji period, all the old Japanese buildings, and had been given some kind of an award for his works in Kyoto. Do you know anybody?
I can't recall the name.
I can't recall his name, but it just reminded me of how committed these Americans living in Kyoto are to the Japanese culture, and they're kind of transferring our values of conservation to the Japanese culture. I thought it was very interesting.
Well, it's something. It's a strange phenomenon. It's I think this might be an example. Part of what I did in the tour business many years is every year I did one tour to China, and I led one tour, and we also always went to Guilin, and I with those incredible mountain scenes, and it's probably one of the most exquisite places in the world, just the Li River.
True.
And I would meet people who live there and speak with them, and they didn't, to them it was just like Main Street. They didn't. I think they appreciated the beauty, but they weren't so taken by it. It was just, that's just their backyard. In the same way, when Japanese people leave Japan, go abroad, for the first time, they realize what they left behind. They realize the extraordinary treasure of what their culture is. That's not saying it's better than other cultures, but they see the strength of their culture. And many of our members in the Japan Craft 21 are Japanese people who have lived abroad and have come back.
But Steve, wouldn't you say your hand?
I think
I'm sorry.
Penelope's had her hand up for the whole time.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Well, and I'm probably the only person on the Zoom meeting, Steve, who's never been to Japan. The closest I've come to it is help the daughter of the Japanese business partner of my then brother-in-law to be married in Chicago. My job was have Emily post will travel, you know, how to make the wedding acceptable and comfortable for the Americans as well as the Japanese guests. It's quite a luxurious event, but as
Mm.
my interests are in food and tea, actually. And you mentioned that you were studying tea. I don't know whether you meant tea ceremony or
Yes.
tea per se.
Tea
And I'd
ceremony.
love to know more about that tea ceremony. And I'd also like to know, you also mentioned that the Japanese food aesthetic reflected the sort of the gestalt of the whole aesthetic idea. And it's very different from my experience anyway, which is limited of Chinese food aesthetic or food
Yeah, it's very
approaches.
different, very
Did
different.
that come at the same time? That it was were Chinese food traditions brought in the early part of bringing things from
Yeah,
Japan and then
no,
Japanified, or
I think in that whole list that I mentioned, food was the only thing, food and food presentation was the only thing I did not mention. There's no, in terms of what I, you know, I'd never actually thought about it, but I have no awareness of any Chinese influence in Japanese food. In fact, you go to a Chinese restaurant in Japan, and it's more often than not that you know, at the finer restaurants they serve it Japanese style. You know, the presentation. It's
and never did have that influence. It
never
was,
did that. No.
so it's sort of the Shinto of food.
Well, it comes a lot from the tea movement of the 1500s, late 1500s, of every meal, everything you eat. I mean, I'm just, you know, this every I'm drinking water out of a shigaraki cup, as you can, I'm sure you can appreciate. This is just part of life. It's not, you know, I have breakfast and I just choose what dishes are we going to use, and you know, we don't have one set of white dishes. We have a million sets of 5. Things often come in sets of 5 in Japan, and it's just mix and match, and every meal is a celebration. So that's the sense that Rikyū brought to dining, to eating.
I understand that they're 5 because 4 is a homonym for death.
Yes.
And my recollection is it correct that is that the tea ceremony, one of the reasons that entrance is so low is that tea ceremony has a sort of a military background, and you cannot come in and attack through a door that small, and you
Well,
put it, I can't remember
yeah.
which foot goes first, but it's the one that keeps you from using your sword.
Well, yes. See,
It's true. Is it not true?
well, there's a lot. I think it's a bigger picture, but what you're saying is true. The room itself is designed. The whole concept was created in a period where there were 4 very vertical levels of socioeconomic levels. There were the samurai at the top, the farmers, the craftspeople, and the merchants at the bottom.
Mm.
And the tea room was the only place where everyone was equal. And so you come through that little door, we all enter in at a very low level. And so everyone comes at the same level. No one is higher than another person. And then
Leave your rank outside.
then there's a place outside where there's a rack where you leave your swords. So the swords are not allowed in the tea room. And then
Shama?
yes, so even today you'll see the same rack outside of tea rooms, little tea houses, and today it's, well, leave your title outside, leave your wealth outside, leave your, you know, your maybe your over sense of yourself outside. Just come in as an equal.
And some of it is similar to the Western handshake. which is if you reach out your hand, empty hand to shake hands, you don't have a sword in it. You know,
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
yeah,
Shama,
interesting.
I loved your presentation just like everybody else. And I just beamed when you mentioned Junichiro Tanizaki in Praise of Shadows. I think what I really, really admire in the Japanese is their sense of beauty. Like in his book, he talks about lacquerwares ideally should be viewed in candlelight. It's designed for that. It's not designed for the bright lights. And then I just beamed, and this is a very odd topic, his description of bathrooms. The bathroom
Oh,
should
yes,
be
absolutely,
wood.
yeah.
So when I saw your cedar bucket, I just purred. I'm like, I want one of them. But the other thing that I loved, I don't have any ceramics. What I loved about the Japanese is, I don't know if you can see it. This was a dish that I had, and there's a little mouse. Can you guys see this? This tiny little mouse, it's rowing itself.
Oh,
But
yes.
what happened is my dish broke. And I did what you would know, kintsugi. I ordered the gold lacquer to put it together, and I think it looks better because of the crack. This is what I really think. I don't understand. It's not the material things that they build, which is superb, but it's their approach to how they view beauty. Something like that Katsuo Okakura had said, what are you trying to teach me in what you have made? It's not just the beauty of it. What was that person who created it trying to send across the centuries? How does one learn? Like, I always think, is it in their waters just to come up with that centuries after centuries after centuries, to have an audience who appreciates what they're saying? Even the fencing in your Koto Inn, just the fencing that is done, the mosses that they put in there, the meticulous care. There's a whole, I don't know, just the ability to appreciate that is just stunning. How does one learn that? I have no clue, but it's amazing.
So that's a great segue for me to, thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you.
No, it's your work that was beautiful. I was gaping.
In fact, I had to shorten this presentation. The original presentation had a slide in about the kintsugi repairing of ceramics. So I'm glad you mentioned. I regret now that I took it out. So I just interviewed a number of craftspeople for an article, and I've just read 154 applications to our contest. We had 154 applicants, and these are people of extraordinary talent, and one of their talents, it does not come automatically, is how to market oneself, how to brand oneself. These are and that's the sad part, that you can actually sell any piece of junk in the world. If you market it enough, there'll be people that'll buy it. And when you have things of extraordinary quality that people aren't buying because they haven't been marketed properly, it's room for improvement. And that's why we started our group. But I went to a brush company, a little tiny company that had 5 people in this company, and they're making brushes. And it takes 10 years to become a master brush person. 10 years. And I was speaking to this woman, she was there 18 years, and she's, it's like, quote unquote, she's just a brush maker. Yeah, she's a master craftsperson. And she's just, but she has this humility. She has no way to market herself. I mean, she's part of a company that does the marketing, but it's beautiful.
I might almost say, I know it's bad for business, but diamond doesn't go seeking, it is sought after. You almost don't want everyone to buy that. You have to have a level of understanding to truly appreciate what brush are you buying. I'd be pissed off if Kim Kardashian bought that brush and then used 20 other brushes and tossed it out. But it's not good for her business, is it? But yeah, I understand what you're saying. Marketing is important.
Are you a snob?
Steve took us to a brush maker.
No,
Went to
I'm
brush
just
makers.
ignorant. Thank you, Jack.
We did go to a brush maker.
I just, Steve, I have a question, man. I work in cultural preservation. I work with performance and dancing, and I've been doing it for almost 40 years, 35 years. I really believe Japan is better than any other country in balancing their traditions with modernity. It's a challenge everywhere. It's nobody's got it, but I think Japan does it better than anybody else. Would you agree with that? I don't think anybody comes close to Japan in incorporating their traditions into their modern life. I just wondered if you agreed with that.
When was the last time you were here?
Oh my gosh, a long time ago, the 90s.
Okay, well, I think you'll be really pleased that what you just said is much more so than it was in the 90s.
I worked with traditional artists in the 90s and 80s a lot. So I was in the middle of all these traditional artists at the time. So I didn't say there was a lot of boom building and an extra excitement about globalization. But even amid that, I felt they got a balance with their traditional arts. Other countries, I think, really struggle to honor them the way Japan does.
But aren't they the only country that has designated national treasures who are their artisans?
I think France does that too. I think France does.
Mm.
But, yes,
Steve,
but
Steve,
in,
I
yeah,
have to go. Unfortunately, because of this odd hour, we had another plan before I knew the time you were going to go. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please keep talking to everybody. Give my love to Rico.
I
Thank
will.
you, Betty.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank
Betty.
you for putting this together.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you
Wonderful.
for being willing to share, my good friend Steve, and thank you, Steve, for sharing beauty and passion you have for Japan. Thank you.
We should ask Steve for his.
Just one point to Joseph. In the 1990s, every hotel built was either French or Italian style. And after the year 2000, no one would build a hotel that wasn't contemporary Japanese architecture. Everything is all sleek, modern, just based on those 16th century aesthetics, but in a modern sense. So it's that's a huge thing. So you see that everywhere. You see that the Japanese architecture now is not trying to copy the West. It's a force in itself. And you know, there are 7 Pritzker winners in Japan. The highest number of any country in the world are Japanese.
Why did they tear down the Imperial Hotel?
Well, that's you know, really, you can still see you can still see the lobby. They moved the lobby to an architecture park. But no, it's, you know, it's not just the Imperial Hotel. There are a lot of buildings which
The Opera Hotel. Why was that? I absolutely cannot believe the Japanese let that hotel be torn down either.
You know, you're coming from Chicago, which you know, if you, excuse me?
We've torn down a lot too, unfortunately.
But compared to the rest of the world, Chicago is like the mecca of architecture, of loving and preserving architecture. You know, I wish every country in the world would follow the lead of Chicago. I wish Japan would.
I would guess that fire hazard was a factor in tearing down of some of the structures.
No, I think it's the real estate.
Yeah.
The Imperial Hotel in 1970 was probably on the most expensive real estate in the world. And having a low-rise hotel just wasn't profitable, unfortunately.
It was so beautiful.
Yes,
Merle?
Thank you. I agree with what everybody said. There's something about seeing image after image after image in this aesthetic, which for me is very soothing. So I'm in just a very mellow frame of mind. But I would like to ask, if I may, a pedestrian question. If you're sitting at home at your desk, reading a book, whatever, and you just feel like a cup of tea, how do you go about preparing it?
Well, you know, there are many kinds of tea in Japan we drink many kinds of tea. And if I have guests, I'll probably serve it in a tea bowl and I'll whisk the tea. powdered tea. But if I'm making for myself, I will make my own powdered tea, or I'll just, I have a small teapot, just a small teapot, a handled teapot, it's a Chinese style actually. And I'll put some tea leaves in it and I'll just pour it into the cup.
So it's without ceremony.
Oh, yes, it's without ceremony, but yes and no. When I make a point of choosing something beautiful to every time I drink something, so that's I'm not walking in and bowing to a group of people, but I make a point of choosing something. It's like, this is my background, and I change this about every 3 weeks, just so it's always fresh. My clothes, almost everything I wear, I have a shirt collection, and it's just this is done by a Yuzen dye artist, and I purchased some antique kimono and I had them made into shirts. It's just when that cup of tea, it's really important that it's not just Lipton in one of these, in a mug made in China that says, Viva Las Vegas on it. It's got to be it's like that cup of tea, and I could just sit on my front stoop and drink this tea in this little garden I have, and that's a magnificent period time, and it's a ceremony, if you want to call it a ceremony. Yes,
It's a very personal ceremony.
very personal, and
Yeah.
I think it's important, especially at this stage of my life, but in any stage of my life, that it's, these little moments which is very much inspired by Sen no Riku, the tea master, give a texture to my life that's really magnificent. Yes.
No, go ahead, Merle. I'll wait.
I know, I was just going to say, it strikes me that the way you describe those very intimate personal moments is a very natural outgrowth of the Japanese aesthetic, as you describe it.
Yeah, coming from
And
suburban Los Angeles, like, where would I have gotten this? I mean, it just wasn't, I had to get it from here. I couldn't have gotten it in LA.
But there's something that undergirds everything we've talked about in Japanese aesthetic and my limited experience with it, where it's an appreciation of the moment.
Mm.
You take nothing for granted. There is joy to be found in every moment.
Shoma?
I really liked how you showed Koto in, because you had that copy of Sen no Riku's lantern. So I like the pictures that you were showing. But I have I know in Japan in the Meiji period, they broke a lot of the Buddhist statues. All of them were gone because they were trying to replace all the Buddhism stuff. So it's not like they preserved all history. They had little gaps in there too. But what I was always found very interesting is when the Mongols came and they
all of them. They didn't break all of them.
Not all, but many fantastic ones that are, because you can see them in the drawings that they no longer exist. But what I think was curious, I asked, who's that man who runs who works for Tao at the Art Institute? White guy who does the Asian stuff.
Oh, the Chinese.
The Chinese stuff.
Yeah.
The assistant to Tao, the white man.
Right. I want to say Clive, but it's not. Very thin English.
Yes, him. So I asked this man, he loves that stuff. So because the Song period really affected the Japanese before, but when the Mongols came, all that went away. But the Japanese took that and they just expanded it to their own beautiful stuff. So I think because the Song period stuff is very muted down, it's very different from the remaining Chinese stuff. But what I want to know, because sorry?
Song and Ming were both very beautiful.
Sure. So the Ming, I don't know. What I was curious when you said
compared to the Qing, I think.
Oh, yeah, no question of that.
No. And you said you studied tea. I have a question. I've been trying to find this. I read somewhere they used to have something called foam tea, not matcha. They had this white foam tea, and then they used these chawans that were glazed inside. So when you drink through it, you actually look at the glazing on the inside. Where do you get that foam tea? It's not
I have
matcha.
to find out. I don't know. I know you can whisk it very foamy, but
No,
that's
no,
not
this
what
was a very, from what I've seen, what I've read, because I've been hunting for this for a mighty long time, just out of sheer curiosity. They made foam tea. They just made the foam. It was the tea. And the whole point was in those chawans that you drinking out of, the insides were glazed a certain color. So when you're experiencing it, it's like moment by moment, everything is being presented to you.
Oh.
There is you're studying tea, you're in Japan. If anybody finds it, it'll be you. And I'm super jealous. But I was like, did you know of that?
No,
That's the aesthetics. I don't get how they come up with these things. It's mind-blowing the subtleties they work at.
well,
They
you know,
have
it's-
more trouble finding it now because if you Google Japanese foam tea, what comes up now is bubble tea.
Yeah. No.
No, want that.
No.
Your task is going to get only harder.
Yeah, but it's marvelous what they came up with. It was way back. So I thought perhaps you would know. If anyone knew, you might know.
you know, it's whenever it's like Japan, and maybe I think Joseph may relate to this or agree with this. It's like Japan is like 500 doors, and it took me years to get a sense of this. But it's like every door goes on forever, and 500 different directions, and it's like. You know, I make pens, but we've been doing it for 500 years. And then the pen we did 500 years ago and the pen we do now is completely different. And I'm continuing to refine the pen, refine it. And the history of and it's how the pen is used and people coming generation after generation of new ways and of improving and more subtle. So it's you know, I've been doing tea for 15 years and I know absolutely nothing. I can't believe it. I go into a tea lesson and it's like, where have I been for 15 years? I don't know what he's talking about. This teacher is talking about it all. I've never heard this before. How that could be. And it just keeps going on. It just never ends. It's a bottomless pit of extraordinary sensitivity and creativity.
And this is tea
So nice.
ceremony as opposed to the tea itself, the particular leaves and their origin and how they're
That's
processed and all
right.
that.
That's exactly. I mean, the tea ceremony is just, it's a total path of personal cultivation.
Yes. Yeah.
It's spiritual, it's social, it's aesthetic, it's everything. It's a way of life. It's a beautiful way of life. It's just
This has been fantastic.
Wonderful.
And I thank you once again. My appreciation of something I knew nothing about has expanded. And thank you for that gift.
it's been a pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Beautiful.
It was
Ciao,
lovely.
ciao.
Thank you, Steve.
I'll
Nice
look
to
for the
meet you.
tea. I'll look for it.
Thank you very much,
Oh,
Steve.
thank you. I'd love that. Thank you.
I could tell Betty and she could get in touch with you.
And if you can tell me where I can get one of those cedar baskets that you trust, one of the craftspeople you support, I genuinely want one.
Oh, the
I've been
bucket?
hunting
Oh,
for one.
yes. I'll just put in the chat now.
Yes. Really, I've been looking for that. If you read that book, Sherry, he describes a bathroom completely wooden, even where you put the commode, that you look outside, the trees out there, so you're part of nature. You just swoon. He's describing a bathroom. I'm like, oh my God. I
But
can't
that's
be in
not
my
on the
bathroom, but I can
28th
have a
floor.
cedar bucket.
There
Where
are
is
your,
that?
Good
You
God.
look
Not on the
chat
28th
are the
floor.
buckets.
Just
Ah,
Google Shuji
Shuji.
Nakagawa
Oh,
bucket.
thank you, Shuji Nakagawa. Oh, I'm so thrilled. This is Christmas. Oh, thank you, Steve. Arigato gozaimasu. Oh, this is lovely.
Bye, everyone. And thank you,
Ciao,
Steve.
Tutti.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.